Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another book rant. Today I'm going to be covering this book, The Steel Wave, by Jeff Shara. This is a historical fiction. I first picked this up back in, I want to say, early high school. I was interested in a lot of 1910s to 1940s era history, not just the world wars, but in general, and that is partly why I was inspired later in college to take a course that specifically focused on 1915 to 1945. I first picked this book up in the library. I read it several times during the few weeks that I had it, and then I felt, this is really good. So I liked this book enough to not only read it in the library, but also to buy it new. I picked this book up in the tail end of my sophomore year, maybe early months of my junior year in high school. So this is specifically a book from 2008, and this is the 2009 Ballantine Books Trade Paperback Edition. This book is a novel, a historical fiction. A lot of the events that take place are roughly how the invasion of Normandy went, but the dialogue, some of the characters, those perspectives are fiction. And this is a book that focuses on the invasion of Normandy. What he says in the foreword really helps to inform what kind of book this is going to be. So I'm going to read portions of it right now. This book is the second volume of a trilogy focusing primarily on America's involvement in World War II in Europe. In each book I've written, I've felt I should add the disclaimer that no, this is not a blow-by-blow history. It is not a comprehensive collection of facts and figures. That kind of book certainly has its appeal, and professional historians are far better qualified to tackle that task than I am. This is a novel, and though I am careful to get it right, by definition, the dialogue and inner thoughts of the characters have to be described as fiction. My research relies almost exclusively on original histories, memoirs, diaries, collections of letters and photographs, as well as interviews with living veterans. No event in the history of the Second World War has inspired more popular attention than what we call D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. As I began the research for this book, I was deeply concerned that I would be telling you a story you already knew too well. But as my research progressed and I dug more deeply, my fears abated. I was surprised to find a story that spreads out with far greater scope than what Hollywood or your high school history textbook typically offers us. As the characters became more familiar to me, I realized that the greatest drama here is not the event, but the raw and frightening uncertainty for everyone involved. It is easy to view history in hindsight as though it were a foregone conclusion how the war, or this particular piece of it, would turn out. But for those men whose deeds and accomplishments created this history, there were no foregone conclusions at all. I also discovered that the story of D-Day is not merely the story of what happens on June 6th. For most of us, our familiarity with the Normandy invasion, comes from the few existing film clips of that one horrific day, used countless times in documentaries, dramas, and various historical features. Memoirs abound and accounts have been written from every perspective imaginable, many focusing on one awful place called Omaha Beach. But there is more to this story than one amphibious invasion across one stretch of sand. My goal is to tell you a good story by taking you into the minds of several of the key participants, the men who made this history, to show you the events as they saw them, to hear their words and their thoughts as this extraordinary drama unfolds. From conflicts and strategy sessions between men at the top to the grinding endurance of the young soldiers who faced the enemy, this book is based on the accounts of the men who were there. My trilogy on the Second World War, of which this is the centerpiece, is the first time I have had the privilege of speaking to living veterans. Those soldiers are fewer in number every day, and in every instance when I interviewed a veteran, he mentioned that fact. I feel strongly that this story has to be told with respect and accuracy. Tribute must be paid. To those soldiers, this is my respectful offering. Now, this author, before this trilogy, wrote a lot about the Civil War, which is why in that note he mentions that this is the first time he had a chance to speak to and interview living veterans. What is really interesting to me is that the first book in this, as he mentions, the trilogy focuses on the war in Europe, specifically the American perspective. The first book in this trilogy focuses on the early war effort following Pearl Harbor, the build up into the military training and everything else, and then the amphibious landings into Africa, the amphibious landing on Sicily, and then the invasion of Italy. But what he does in this is primarily focus on the airborne divisions. The airborne divisions dropped behind enemy lines before the invasion, the amphibious landings, and then disrupted the enemy's efforts from behind those lines. They were there to take out battery stations. They were there to disrupt communications lines. They were there to slow down reinforcements. They were there to make it so that the men landing on those beaches had a good chance of making it to the next step. And he does a good job of making that seem doable. This book focuses on the lead up to the paratroopers drop behind the enemy lines, as well as their stabilizing of the lines, and it closes up with the breakout. The moment in the invasion of France where the British and American troops broke through the lines of the Germans and around them and spread rapidly through France and eventually on to Germany. This is one of those books where the perspective changes frequently. One of the primary perspectives is a fictional character, last name Adams, and this is a guy allegedly from like Silver City, New Mexico, who then ends up in the 82nd Airborne, lands in Sicily, and then lands in the invasion of Normandy. So by the time Normandy rolls around, the number of green paratroopers is high, but the veterans to that airborne division have some experience and are able to guide them, whereas during Sicily, everyone was entirely new to the airborne operations. So it does focus a lot on a veteran's perspective, someone who has that experience and is able to lead to some degree the men that were there to help him. There are two quotes at the start of part one. Jeff Shara realized that they help mold the reader's perspective of both sides of the war. Friedrich von Bernhardi lived from 1849 to 1930 and is quoted, "We Germans have a far greater and more urgent duty towards civilization to perform. We, like the Japanese, can only fulfill it by the sword. War is a biological necessity." The second one, "We are determined that before the sun sets on this terrible struggle, our flag will be recognized throughout the world as a symbol of freedom on the one hand, of overwhelming power on the other." General George C. Marshall, 1942. This book did help me learn a bit about the history. It shows some maps throughout the book showing where certain things, certain events were supposed to happen. And it does use a few lighter events as well. One of the oddities of the invasion of Normandy was that a few days before the invasion of Normandy, a crossword puzzle in a English newspaper had a lot of words that the war effort thought were indication of a spy attempting to communicate key phrases to the Germans. And and obviously the Germans had spies in the area, but the Germans, even up to June 6th, for the most part thought that the invasion was going to happen across the shortest gap of water between England and France, rather than where they actually landed, which was a bit wider of a gap. So when words like overlord, Omaha, sword, Utah started showing up in a crossword puzzle a few days before the event, it caused a big stir. And as has later been found out, the person who puts together the crossword puzzles, or the person who put together that crossword puzzle, was a headmaster at a British prep school. And he was taking words from suggestions that he received from the students at his school. And the boys at his school, while they were in town over the last few months, had heard a lot of these same words: Omaha, overlord, sword. All of these major keywords spoken by the non-commissioned officers and the officers of the US and British Army. And so they heard these words spoken by men of power, men involved in the war effort, and thought, oh, that's a really cool word. So eventually they submitted it to the crossword puzzle. He wrote up a crossword puzzle that had some of these words, and it played out all right. He wasn't in too great a trouble after that. And there's a lot of other ones. There's smaller human moments where there's a lieutenant that figures out from a note, a letter from his wife, that she's 6 months pregnant, but he's been gone for the last 9 months. And he says, I'm willing to try and work it out. But he's reflecting on this with Adams, the man I talked about, the character I talked about earlier. There's a lot of those moments kind of similar to what I talked about when discussing Toward the Flame, where there's these moments where the characters in this book will have a conversation with someone, and then 20 pages later that person will be dead, or that person will be injured and taken out of the war. These people, he never sees them again, because all that he is focusing on is the present, not the future, not the past, only the people he knows in that moment. I'm going to try and find a good example of one of the maps that are used. So I don't know how well this will show up in the camera, but here's a good example of one of the maps. The map key reads 82nd Airborne drops, the bridges at La Fière and Chez Dupont, with every little parachute being where the paratroop landings were supposed to be. A lot of that grayish land is flooded ground. Roads are very clearly roads, train tracks are very clearly train tracks, and bridges are denoted with a little bracket around a road. One major thing that goes on with the airborne invasion is that the Germans, though they didn't know exactly where the Allies were going to invade, what they did in advance of the invasion was let a lot of dikes free. So water that had been held up in dams were now flooding areas. And when taking aerial photography, you see trees sticking up. You don't think, oh, that's flooded water, flooded ground. You think, oh, those are still trees there. They are still there. We need to land in these flat areas. Or if the flooding was so deep, what looks like grassy plains may actually be the tops of trees in flooded areas. When the paratroopers were landing, they were scattered all over the countryside, but more importantly, a lot of them ended up falling into water. And not only did they need to disconnect their parachute, they then also needed to, while weighed down with all of this gear, find a shore to get out of. And, while swimming with all that heavy gear, they're making a lot of noise, which makes it more likely that Germans nearby are going to see them and shoot them in the water, even if they managed to live the whole drop and disconnect from the parachute. they may still get shot in the water. And so that was one of the major issues that they had to face, because now there were people on opposite sides of the water and they needed to coordinate attacks on a bridge or across the area. And because some of them landed in water, they couldn't use their electrical equipment because that ended up getting fried. So a lot of smaller details that don't get picked up by a lot of the documentaries, a lot of the movies you see about World War II, about, you usually see the Battle of the Bulge, the invasion of Normandy. You don't see these paratrooper landings. You don't see the invasion of Sicily in any of the movies. Rarely do you see it in documentaries. So these are stories that aren't highlighted in Hollywood or in the general popular space of World War II histories, which makes this book really fascinating to me. And when I first read it back in high school, I thought, this is a really cool book. I reread this book several times, and I've enjoyed it every time I read it. I think I only ever read book one in this series once, and I read book three in the trilogy once. And there were a couple moments that stuck out to me in book three. As I said, though, I loved this book. I read it a couple times when I had borrowed it from the library. I bought this used, and I've read it several times since buying it. Mostly I read it in high school and maybe once or twice in college. I haven't read this book in several years because I've been bogged down with all the books behind me. I love all these books behind me, but they take time to read through, and it often leaves me with only a bit of time to reread a book. And when I've got all these great books, how do I narrow that choice down? So this one I haven't read in a while, but I have a lot of good memories of it, and I think it was very educational. Hopefully, this kind of book is one that you are willing to pick up and read yourself if you have any interest in this subject. My name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another book rant.